Um, so hello everyone. On behalf of Economic and Political Weekly, I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar today titled Debating the Dravidian Model, Achievements and Limitations. Uh, so over the years, the pages of the EPW have witnessed a vibrant and rigorous debate on the historical, cultural, economic, social, and political aspects of the state of Tamil Nadu. And one of the major lines of inquiry in this ongoing discussion is the notion of what is called the Dravidian model, which has invited considerable perspectives from many disciplinary standpoints. So some of the common questions pursued in this discussion include, is there a Dravidian model? If yes, what are its unique and distinguishing features? What are its purported strengths and weaknesses or achievements and limitations? Can it serve as a model for other states in India? And perhaps most importantly, what is its future in an increasingly polarized national political climate? So several scholars have weighed in on these questions within and beyond the pages of EPW, raising the stakes of this deliberation into a collective intellectual exercise. So this webinar is an attempt to provide a small glimpse of these ongoing discussions to a wider audience. Um, so before I introduce our speakers, let me just quickly outline the format of today's webinar. Each of our speakers will first provide their opening statements for about 7 to 10 minutes. And after that, we will open the webinar for discussion where speakers can ask questions to each other, apart from taking questions from the audience, of course. Audience members are requested to post their questions or comments in the chat box, and they can do so throughout the discussion. And they're also requested to keep their audio off during the webinar. Now, let me introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Kalaiyarasan, Dr. Kalai is an assistant professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai, and a visiting research fellow at King's College, London. His academic interests lie in understanding patterns of inequalities and comparative political economy in the global south. He is the author of The Dravidian Model, Interpreting the Political Economy of Tamil Nadu, with Professor M. Vijayabaskar, who is also one of the panelists today. Geetha is a feminist historian and publisher who writes in Tamil and English on gender, caste, labor, civil rights, and education. She's the author of many works, including Bhimarao Ramji Ambedkar and the Question of Socialism in India, Undoing Impunity, Speech After Sexual Violence, and Towards the Non-Brahmin Millennium, from Eoti Thas to Periyar, the last book co-authored with S.V. Rajadurai. Professor John Harris is Professor Emeritus at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, having previously taught at the London School of Economics and the University of East Anglia in the UK. He's the author of Capitalism and Peasant Farming, Agrarian Structure and Ideology in Northern Tamil Nadu, a 1982 work, if I'm not wrong. But I would also, recommend all our listeners to read his 2022 EPW article titled "The Politics of Dignity and Development: The Tamil Nadu Story," which I think gives a really useful overview of some of the themes and questions that we'll be discussing today. Professor Judith here is an emeritus fellow at Somerville College, Oxford, where she taught economics until she retired. She has done extensive fieldwork on changes in villages in Tirupur district, Western Tamil Nadu, since 1980, looking particularly at the impact of economic development on different caste groups, different classes, and on men versus women. She's the editor of Indian Capitalism in Development and the Comparative Political Economy of Development, Africa and South Asia. Both the books co-edited with Professor Barbara Harris-White. Finally, Professor M. Vijayabaskar is a professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai. His research centers on the political economy of development in Tamil Nadu, with a focus on labor and land markets, human development, and their intersections with policy making. He has co-authored the book, as I mentioned, The Dravidian Model, Interpreting the Political Economy of Tamil Nadu, with Dr. Kalai. Apart from, of course, this brief bit of introduction, I would also recommend all of our listeners to read the articles of all the panelists in the pages of EPW. I think they've contributed immensely to the question that we are discussing today, as well as questions of national and as well as perhaps universal concern. So With that, I would like to invite Dr. Kalai to please give his opening statement. Dr. Kalai, you can please speak now.
Thank you, and Keith, for this generous introduction and also for this opportunity. And it certainly gives me immense pleasure and privilege, certainly, to be part of this eminent panel. In fact, some of these authors whose work I read, grew up reading, and in fact, learned from their work. In fact, laid the foundation for my own intellectual thinking. So definitely, that sense, it gives me a privilege to be part of this panel. And I'm just going to address two aspects. Of course, you mentioned the Dravidian model and so many aspects of it. How it, whether it is to be emulated in the growing setup, uncertainty, polarization, all that. But I'm going to give only, because my training is in economics, although I work in interdisciplinary frame. But I'm going to talk only two aspects. One of what it is actually when you understand the model here. Is it model to be emulated, or is there a certain character or certain pattern that one can see in the case of Tamil Nadu? One, and what are the strengths? What is achievements, so to say, or intervention that made certain form, certain way of or certain kind of development, I would say, as inclusive development in the state, and its limitations and the fault lines. That's I would address. So where do we place state in a broad development indicators or the development pattern in India? Again, I have to make a certain qualification caveat here. I'm going to look at this question through of what is known as subnational development literature in India. In the sense, there are tons of literature to say why certain regions grow or not grow, or do develop in a particular way, or inclusive, not exclusive, that kind of debate. In that, where does Tamil Nadu stand? So in that, I'm just going to show one slide. I think that perhaps, can I, so this is the broad big picture that I would like to provide. I think this gives us a template to understand where does Tamil Nadu stand. The literature is well known. In fact, I take this frame largely from Professor Janaris is here. His first work, I think it's not first work, it's a very important work of the political regimes in India. I think it's a late 99. I think I see is a classic paper, and anybody who works on understanding India's subnational story or the state pattern, I think that is the essential text. In fact, provides a framework to understand and locate the political regimes and growth and development in any state in India. Of course, it covered the most of the major states. So in that, if you're using that frame, and how do you classify it today? We classified certain way of caste and class in late 90s. If I extract that and put it in a developmental map, where does those, in fact, where do those states categorize, how do we categorize? I think broadly I would categorize here. Tamil Nadu and Kerala probably would actually stay bits of will of having degree of growth and development. What I mean by degree of growth and development here is the growth normally defined as a per capita income, or broadly of the per capita, the industrialization in a income side or industry side. Whereas the development broadly is known, say, education, health, and other broad, if you use sense the framework. So in that case, there are clear pattern. One see, the Tamil Nadu and Kerala stands out, and Gujarat and Maharashtra did indeed better in many ways in growth, but not has been inclusive. It's again well documented. Himachal now actually better, fantastic in terms of school education, not been much in terms of industry, but recent time we see the growing interest of industries too there. But again, the North Indian states, largely Uttar Pradesh, or Uttar Pradesh is a sample here who stands out neither in the growth nor in the development. This is again when I use this indicators, when I use this frame, which I mean roughly as of the relative sense, it's not to every indicators the states would be doing good in the respective way. No, not at all. So now the question is, having made this case here, the Tamil Nadu stands out along with Kerala in certain sense. How do we explain this? Is it the specific state? And I think that's where the most of the contention lies in. If you follow the EPW debate, it's largely of the contention is, how do we interpret this outcome? Is it the outcome of a conscious political intervention of the last 70 years, of the last 100 years? Or is there any historical determinism attached to it? And because the region had a certain historical advantage because of the colonial frame or later other things, therefore it actually did what the outcome that we see today is that I think that's the most contentious thing in the debate. Second, actually, the important is the fault lines. Is the fault lines that we see today, of course, with respect to education, with respect to health, or with respect to caste, with respect to gender, all of them are much rooted in the frame itself, or is it is a post facto outcome that necessarily happens, or maybe it's just growth and development happens. The certain people are excluded. It's a conscious decision built in, or is it something is a factor that beyond its constituents? That I think that's something is a question that we are grappling with. Now, next question is about how this actually became possible. I'm taking the political agency. I really see, beside this historical advantage, beside all of those factors that contributed this region, there is also definitely conscious political labor attached to building a certain social coalition, I would say as a broad social coalition, despite all its fault lines, that actually was responsible for building or instituting certain policy interventions. That intervention, namely in the education, particularly ensuring access to education to the most of the groups, including school and higher education. Second, ensuring a certain degree of public health, particularly building wide network of public health centers in the state. In whatever measure that if you compare with the rest of India, it would definitely stand out in that. And the third, of course, of the certain degree of the capital penetration, allowing the low caste and others, are broad basing what I would call as a capital accumulation too. I think broad, and also degree of working condition, in the sense, of course, there are serious problems to be there we see now today. But yet, if you look at the certain indicators, we see clearly it stands out, at least to degree, I would say. So broadly, all of this actually was possible because of the social coalition and the kind of intervention that made possible, intervening each of this domain. So having said this, all of this actually do not have any fault lines. Yes, definitely. Why? Because I would think of this fault line, I would say, or particularly of the education and health and other problems, I would say it's all of the second generational issues. Tamil Nadu, I would say, broadly has achieved or done. I've been dealing with, say, of ensuring at least first level of access. I would say the first level of developmental reform would be largely the access, education, health, and etc. But the second level of second generational reform, I would think of as a quality aspect of reform, whether the healthcare or the education outcome is good, those GR that we see is relatively better, whether they are actually employable or how much is really empowering, and the health center, whether they are working, not working. But having said this, even there, I would say the recent intervention actually gives me some kind of promise or some kind of hope that the few years that we see of the state coming in, particularly of intervening in the health and intervening in education, ensuring addressing at least new forms of inequality, particularly of the school education between the government school versus the private school. At least there I see some intervention is happening, and we can go in detail. Again, in health too, we see some intervention happening, particularly containing the out-of-pocket expenditure, which is basically the household spends or ended up spending in the private care. I think that's become the important issue for the many health economists. I think that state seems to be addressing that question relatively. We see the figures coming up clearly. So that actually is the of the recent changes. But big question is definitely the new forms of caste atrocity, new forms of caste inequalities emerging, and new forms of class inequalities also emerging within those communities, within those caste groups. I think these two are very important, I think significant political development, which has political ramification, of course, is rooted in the economic paradigm, but as a political ramification, whether the coalition that actually made this growth possible can be sustainable given this new kind forms of inequality that is emerging, which is between caste, and even the caste blocks that we saw as a homogeneous are actually fractured now between, say, OBCs. There are all kind of factions within that, between particularly MBC and the dominant caste groups within OBCs. And you also see the certain, fracture within Dalit, and also class question within those communities. Definitely class question, particularly the post-90s, the 30 years. One important thing, it's just not about Tamil Nadu, it's actually applicable to the rest of India too. Inside, that's what you call within inequality of the caste, basically class inequality within caste actually has gone up. Whereas while you see the convergence among the caste group with respect to range of indicators, which I can see within Tamil Nadu too, of if you look at the Dalit non-Dalit versus if you look at the education indicators, there's a greater level of convergence. I think I would think of this, the violence that actually takes place or the kind of cost conflict that we see today is the outcome or perhaps is the relative mobility of Dalits or relative mobility of certain caste groups actually makes the dominant in the respective regions actually unsettling. I think that is something we see not just in India. Of course, we see the dominant caste protest across India, particularly of resentful to the Dalit mobility or the low caste mobility. But it's also true across world. Particularly if you take the America of the black mobility, how the Trump actually capturing or of the white working class insecurity against the partly relative mobility of the blacks in the US, and you can see the immigrant question in the most. So there's a global ramifications. Now, this is one level of the global trend. One limitation that we need to think of any of these indicators is as Ankit mentioned, the proving polarization in this country, because that actually one level is political, another level it has a serious connection to the economic development, model of development we think of at the state level is the federal question. Whether state can any longer achieve or kind of chart out autonomous development given the curtailment of the state powers. As the former finance minister recently mentioned, states are becoming municipalities. So that's a level now. So how much actually we think of the states have any power that way of charting out an autonomous trajectory of development? I think something we need to think of. And of course, there are global connections to limits of my observations of with respect to what we understand the Dravidian models in its achievements and limitations has to be seen in this big picture and the broader context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kalai, for that really interesting opening statement. I mean, it really set the tone for some of the broad questions that I hope we'll be pursuing today. So, Geetha, ma'am, you can please speak now.
Thank you very much for asking me to be part of this panel. I'm actually going to read out my remarks so that I stay within the stipulated 10 minutes. The Dravidian model is a phrase that circulates widely today. The Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu refers it almost every other day. His ministers invoke it to explain and justify their stance, their policies, their work, and ideologues associated not only with the Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, but also with the parliamentary left, use the term the Dravidian model as a measure of counter-hegemony that we might yet establish in relationship to the ruling Hindu right. The notion of a Dravidian model has also given a new lease of life to a vigorous anti-Brahmanism, which repeats the verities established in the past regarding Brahmanical authority claims. And I use the term repeats in a fairly specific sort of way because we don't quite see a new conceptual understanding of Brahmanism in keeping with the changing historical conditions and circumstances. We see an older model of Brahmanism being invoked, supported by empirical details from the present. And this is done largely to affirm the continuing relevance of the Dravidian movement. And this is as far as this polity is concerned and the sort of very distinctive Dravidian politics that we have come to associate with Tamil Nadu is concerned. Now, in the Tamil public sphere, in writings, in social media, and in print, the Dravidian model has become a contentious term. And in fact, social media has seen some extremely acrimonious and sometimes very ugly battles for those who are for the Dravidian model and those who oppose it are both given to a lot of angry polemic that you see in different aspects of social media. And interestingly, the book that gave rise to the phrase, Kalaiyarason's book, is not really discussed or even sort of invoked in substantial terms, but its title has proved a draw. And it has become a focal point for enumerating the many sins and of commission and omission of the Dravidian parties, and also an argument for some sort of a continuance of Dravidian rule, especially in the current context of what's unfolding in the rest of India. Now, interestingly, those who've come to criticize the Dravidian model from an explicit Dalit point of view have echoed arguments, not perhaps consciously, but arguments that Professor Harris and Hare have already made in their writings on the book, especially Judith's remarks that the Dravidian model has to be viewed, and I quote, in light of the deep-seated hostility towards Dalits seen in discrimination against them and caste atrocities continuing to the present day. Tamil Nadu is known for its casteism with very strong antagonism to Dalits and severe infighting among other caste groups. Kalai has, of course, urged us to see this in a kind of a historical sense, seeing this as a kind of a latter-day development and something that's unfolding at the second phase or a new generational historical context. But we can come back to that question later. Now, interestingly enough, the book's content, the Dravidian model's content, has been read in the shadow of another set of arguments, those that feature in this other book, Rule of the Commoner, by Subbagunarajan and Rajan Kurai and others, which some view as a companion volume, though I'm sure such intentions are hard to define or put in place. And it's quite telling that Rupa Vishwanath's critique of this book, which featured in EPW, was translated into Tamil and published in the anti-caste journal Neelam, which has been begun by, amongst others, the film director Pa Ranjit and a group of Dalit cultural activists. It's interesting because I think the Dalit critiques saw Rupa's long review of the book as bringing together all their arguments as to why they find Dravidian rule problematic. So therefore, to speak of the Dravidian model in the Tamil context is a fairly fraught exercise. And today what I want to do is to restrict myself to the book really, and not to these larger debates. And here I really want to focus on the book's method, the method that is employed to come up with this idea of the Dravidian model, and also the arguments that proceed from some of the premises it has outlined as important for its analysis and argument. So the book works with the idea that the making of what it calls non-Brahmin historic bloc, it produced an expansive horizontal solidarity comprising various undercaste groups and Dalits. And these came to be held together by a notion of Tamilness and Tamil identity. This is not to be confused with ethnographic nationalism. Instead, Tamil identity, the book's authors argue, have to be unpacked in terms of its constituents, which include social justice, a commitment to a productive economic ethos, a distinctive modern reckoning with progress and growth, and a role for the state in taking forward these ideas. And the book further argues that these ideals which comprise Tamilness has resulted in a Dravidian common sense, comprising a sense of social entitlement expressed as claims by the populace on the government, such that it is held accountable to its ideological and political origins. And in turn, governments in Tamil Nadu, and I use the word governments rather than state, which I will reserve for the Indian state, and successive governments of whatever political persuasion have responded in self-conscious ways of the Dravidian legacy. And I think this is a fair enough summary because they've also included, somewhat sparingly, references to the welfarism that was pursued by K. Kamaraj in the 1950s. Now, the book argues its case in two ways, through a set of figures that represent the outcome of policies that have come about on account of a political realization of the so-called Dravidian model, and by linking the ideas that animated the Dravidian movement in its heyday, especially its self-respect phase, to governance in the state. So I don't think I'm competent to judge figures. I'm not trained in economics, or to decide if they represent a model of people-centered development which is unique to Tamil Nadu. I won't get into that at all. Though I must say I am curious what an analysis of figures across the southern states would yield, rather than a comparison with Gujarat and Uttar Pradesh or Gujarat and Maharashtra, especially of the relationship between ideology and governance and political history and economic outcomes, because Andhra Pradesh saw a very long and protracted left militant struggle against various forms of inequity, and some of which incited responses from governments. And Kerala has seen on and off a communist government. Karnataka has also had a very vigorous anti-caste movement, especially a Dalit movement. So it would be interesting to see these translated into outcomes in what ways and where are the differences and solidarity and similarity. In any case, that's by the way. Now, with regard to the second argument, that one can actually account for the Dravidian model by tracing it historically to the principles that animated the Dravidian movement. And here, Baskar and Kalai invoke quintessentially Gramscian terms, the idea of a historical bloc, Dravidian common sense, and how these have shaped governance. It seems to me, and here is my first query about method, it seems to me that these terms actually play a rhetorical rather than a substantial role in their argument. Because they help the authors to construct what they would like us to believe is a unity of civil aspiration and state action. And such unity is produced conceptually and through figures. And I'm not convinced that such a unity historically exists in exactly the manner they make it out to be. And this is my first query. And here I think the problem for me is really with the author's use and understanding of the term populism, which they, of course, point to and then speak of how others have used it in the past. But they explicitly draw on Ernesto Laclau. And it seems to me that Laclau's own understanding of the term, which goes back to his quarrels with Soviet Marxism back to the 1980s, empties the term populism of political content and also ahistoricizes it to a considerable extent. So what we miss here also in this book is an analysis of populism in all its granular details. Because populism is seen largely in terms of how the state has presented itself, rather than as a broad political category which helps us understand state action in relationship to the citizenry at large. And so we don't have a sense of how the state works with difference, with dissent, for example, with intransigent populations. How does a state machinery function in delivering outcomes? What are the means through which outcomes are made desirable? And a host of other questions to do with communication. For instance, for undivided Andhra Pradesh, Balagopal, the late civil rights activist, had shown how ameliorative policies, especially under the late N.T. Ramarao of the Telugu Desam, were part of a complex project of rule and governance, the other parts of which included deliberate acts of state terror and the tacit appeasement of forces of reaction. Balgopal has done this through a series of fantastic essays on NTR and subsequently of Chandrababu Naidu, and how a rule of law and order is actually established through unaccountable acts of the criminal justice system. Though while this might seem particular to Andhra Pradesh given its long history of left militancy, I do think that it holds valuable lessons for any analysis of populism, which is why I invoke it here. So in the Tamil Nadu context, that the government has been made accountable to the people is a nice idea, but I'm not sure if it is more than an idea in all cases. So we need to have a sense of in exactly what ways is it accountable, to who is it accountable, and we need to establish this and delineate it through specific studies and not only through figures and numbers. What we need is not simply a sense of government as a welfarist, social justice oriented state in waiting, because the Tamil Nadu government is also a state in waiting. It does have aspirations to be a nation state, at least in an idealistic sense. So therefore, we need a sense of how this works at the level of molecular reality, at the level of, as someone in the civil liberties movement, I always think of the civil liberty of the state in its particular guises, at the level of the Thana, at the level of the Tehsil, of the local police headquarters, in terms of how sub-inspectors behave, tahsildars behave, how the local magistrates treats a matter of arrest. That is the state for most of us, or the government for most of us, in whatever manner we speak of it. So therefore, one needs to also think of how everyday acts of petty impunity directed especially against large sections of a fairly defenseless population, denotified communities, sections of Dalits who are still defenseless in a social sense, those who are termed habitual offenders, and how this everyday criminalization of a considerable section of the population has made it possible to ignore and criminalize dissent even in this Dravidian state. This happened continuously during the regime of the AIADMK, which we must not forget ruled for a considerably long time and has contributed as much to the Dravidian model of welfarism plus reservation as the DMK has. And that regime was particularly authoritarian. And in fact, a lot of what we see in the larger central government context is something that many state governments have rehearsed over and over again. This is something that Rajashekar points out in his book on state governments and state governance. So that's something to work with. So the point I wish to make is that one cannot treat the fault lines, as Kalai describes them, as fault lines that emerge at a latter point in time. Neither are these extraneous to governance. I see these as very crucial to its intrinsic project itself. The violence that is continuously and in an everyday sense directed at underclasses and castes, and the violence that Dravidian parties, both the DMK, AIADMK, have used continuously against striking workers, students, environmental activists, and any number of left radicals. And you see this also from result in a kind of a political indifference to social suffering as such. The kind of issues that have come up over the last few years, and not just this present last 5 years, but the set of atrocities against Dalits, to use that term, though I think that term gives it a melodramatic aspect and does not capture its everyday quality. And that this is something that has been met with political indifference. There's no political will to counter it. It's not that the mechanisms don't exist. It's not that Dalits don't fight back, but governments have been indifferent and have refused to display the political will to counter it, as we saw with respect to the Vachati incident, where Adivasi people suffered greatly under various aspects of the state and central and paramilitary forces, and in continuing issues to do with violence against Dalits, which both governments have condoned and not sufficiently dealt with. And this is clear from the various reports of commissions that were established to probe into these various acts. And so I think we need to have a sense of how we square this functioning of the state, which is both habitual, but which habit then becomes a way of functioning in exceptional circumstances as well. And how does one square this with welfarism and social justice? I think they are both linked together and very fundamentally they co-constitute each other, which is why I think the use of the term populism in a Laclauian sense is deeply problematic. The next thing I wish to do is that one of the things that we need to also think here is how does one then think of that history, whether there's something wrong with the foundational model itself, as Kalai raised that question. This is like, whether Stalin is like Lenin or not. I don't wish to get into that kind of an argument, but basically to say if history is indeed important, then we should perhaps be asking the question, what have subsequent political Dravidian formations done to renew public memory of that history beyond formal ceremonial affirmations? Is it reflected in textbooks? Is it reflected in a culture of public communication, which is not only by particular sectoral groups committed to Periyar's vision of anti-Brahmanism and anti-casteism? The state must provide us with ocular evidence that it is indeed interested in renewing that historical memory. Unlike, say, Maharashtra, where for all kinds of problems notwithstanding, the state government did publish the writings of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. The Tamil Nadu government has shown no such will to do anything with the writings of Periyar. If one were to just pick up one very sort of specific kind of an example. So therefore, if it is indeed a historical legacy that lives on, how come that history is not available as rich public memory? And that's something, again, that we need to ask and link it to the question of populism, because populism and memory and history have a very sort of uneven relationship to each other. Populism thrives because it can also fudge memory. It can also play with memory. So there is that. Then the other thing is, to me, the idea of the Dravidian model as sketched out in this book and in public arguments is really state-centered in terms of method, in terms of data. So what would be interesting is to also think of how might we understand how these policies are fed. We need an ethnographic processing of outcomes. We need to get a sense of how do people inhabit public health spaces, of educational spaces. What does it mean to go to a government school, which increasingly is only accessed by extremely backward communities' children, or by Dalit children, or by children from the denotified communities. So what does it mean to be part of these achievements, so to speak? And I think such ethnographic details have not been the part of any kind of an exercise in trying to understand the Dravidian model. And that's something that is available in literature, for example. If not, one can't do these kinds of studies. There's enough literary expressions that one might wish to draw upon. And even if the Tamil Nadu government has sort of come to school education in a kind of a sort of an extremely ameliorative and critical manner in the current phase, I still see it as a top-down approach. There is very little engagement with actors on the ground, with issues that people face in terms of how the citizenry responds to the school system. There's a great interest in setting up institutions of governance, but not enough with the population at large. So that is something that we need to think about. And the last point I wish to make, and I'm sure this has been made by Judith and Barbara in different contexts, Barbara Harris-White, is I'm really dismayed at how this notion of the Dravidian model has refused to engage with scholarship on gender and economics. It's not for want of a literature being available. And I think recently some very important questions, and again featured in the review of women's studies in EPW, especially during the COVID years and after, you see that feminists have raised some very important questions about the skewed relationship as far as women's lives are concerned between education and employment, and education and the caste family. And does education actually work against a caste family or endogamy? And how education has perhaps given a twist to endogamy in an extremely fatal sort of way. And between employment and familial justice, or in short, domestic violence, all of which were answered in the negative during various studies conducted during the pandemic when women were at home, and which has also been argued out in wider circles by lots of others, including Mary John and so on and so forth, at an all India context. So I think what we need to reckon with then when we talk of the Dravidian model is the whole gender question, and how these are perhaps not translated into substantial outcomes for a very large number of women, or not nearly enough outcomes to justify the kinds of claims that are being made about what has come to be enduring in Tamil Nadu. And I think here, even just a passing sort of reference to studies on female indebtedness, for example, or female labor, would have really opened up this question in some interesting ways, and that hasn't happened. And here I'll just end with this, and I think a lot of work has been done by feminists with regard to health as well, the health sector, because after all, both health and education have to do with social reproduction. It's the women who accumulate a huge pile of debt to ensure children go to school and children and the elderly stay well. So, and I think this whole literature has called attention again and again to unpaid care labor, both at home and, importantly, in the context of caste, underpaid public care labor of sanitary workers, of hospital assistants, of ad hoc faculty who, like the Anganwadi workers, many of whom are from the undercaste, and a substantial section of which is Dalit. So I think these are questions that one needs to sort of think through as one thinks of the Dravidian model as a possible counter to the ruling dispensation today. And I think while we do that, we also need to ask ourselves if a populist mode of governance, which sort of combines welfarism and appeal across differently situated unequal caste groups and Dalits, is not something that the right can play as well as the progressive liberal left. I mean, the whole scenario that might unfold in Bihar, for example, points to such a possibility. So unless there's also a critical sense of governments and state, which goes beyond just enumerating policies and governance, and really goes back to an old-fashioned left-brain critique of state systems, especially in these neoliberal times, drawing from very strong feminist and anti-caste studies to do with politics, I think one can't quite make a case for the Dravidian model with as much hope and enthusiasm as one wishes to. This is not to decry any of the gains that have been made, but to say such gains are really only a fragmentary part of this very complex picture that we have in the state of Tamil Nadu today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geetha ma'am, for these really important questions and reflections. I'm sure we'll return to these questions in the discussion as well. So now I'd like to invite Professor Harris to speak. Professor Harris, you can speak now.
Unmute myself. Is that okay? Yeah, okay.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Geetha, that yours is a very, very hard act to follow. That was a really terrific discussion of the book. Thank you. And I might just sort of comment on or refer you speaking of lack of attention to gender questions in the Dravidian model. Having just read Isabelle Guérin, Satish Kumar, and Venkat Subramanian's The Indebted Woman, we do have some pretty good ethnography on some aspects of gender relations in contemporary Tamil Nadu. Anyway, I'd just like to sort of start again, as it were, by thanking the Economic and Political Weekly for inviting me to take part in this event today, and also to thank Kalaiyarasan for writing what is unquestionably a significant and provocative book. And that I've been critical of it and will be critical of it today shouldn't detract from my appreciation of its achievement. I'll sort of try to get straight to the point and to what, for me, are the two most important weaknesses in the analysis offered by the book. The qualifications that Geetha has just entered into it, I think is extremely important, but there is still no question about the distinctive record of development in Tamil Nadu, with its relatively high levels of success in regard both to social justice and to economic growth. Though I think we should remember Judith Hayer's remark at one point about the relatively unfavorable record of Tamil Nadu by comparison, for example, with Vietnam, perhaps with other states in Southeast Asia. And there's no question in my mind about the positive outcomes of what I once called competitive populism in the state. Okay, but the big questions for me are, well, firstly, the extent to which the Dravidian common sense that you celebrate and that Geetha has talked of a little was as inclusive as you claim, and in particular about the extent to which the Dravidian movement has included Dalits. I noted one of the conclusions reached by Geetha and Rajadure in their book Towards a Non-Brahmin Millennium, where they write, the Dravidian movement's early emphasis on untouchability, the destruction of caste, and women's emancipation was gradually abandoned. MSS Pandian, too, wrote in the 1990s of the ideological retrogression of the Dravidian parties in regard to caste. And for me, the abundant evidence of the continuing exclusion and oppression of Dalits is not at all effectively rebutted in the text of the Dravidian model. And of course, it's even conceded amongst the fissures and slippages discussed in the final chapter of the book. As Geetha said a few moments ago, this is not the discrimination against Dalits on an everyday level. You know, it's not a recent phenomenon, for heaven's sake. Anyway, I think probably others may want to say more or reflect more on this aspect of the book than me. And I wanted to note, passing on, that we shouldn't forget the authoritarian tendencies of all the three great leaders of the Dravidian parties, MGR, Karunanidhi, and Jayalalitha, and their quite frequent recourse to police power. And I just want to emphasize, if I can, the points that Geetha made a few moments ago about the extent of the criminalization of dissent under the Dravidian parties. But the second big question that I want to raise, it really refers to a question that, Kalay, you referred to at the beginning of your remarks, but didn't really, I think, then elaborate on at all, which is the question of, is this model, if there is one, the outcome of conscious policy, or is it rather the result of a sort of long-run historical legacy? And that, I think, for me, is a very important question. So the second big question then has to do with the core argument of the book about how the pursuit of social justice and the economic development of the state have been mutually reinforcing. if there is such a thing as a Dravidian model, then this is it. And indeed, at one point, Kalaiyarasan, you argue that the Dravidian common sense really boils down to caste-based reservation plus productivist policy aimed at achieving inclusive modernity. And you make much of the idea that the Dravidian movement, going way back, has consistently pursued a productivist economic policy directed at realizing inclusive economic growth. The leaders of the movement, you argue, though I think with rather slender direct evidence, had the aim of increasing employment outside agriculture, so taking people out of caste-based agrarian production relations that are inherently exploitative and socially oppressive. So the Dravidian parties haven't bothered much with land reform, not because of electoral reliance on more substantial landowners among the OBCs, as some of us have thought might be possible, but as a matter of deliberate policy, a policy really of bypassing the agrarian question. The success of the productivist approach, you argue, is shown particularly in the facts, firstly, that structural transformation has proceeded further in Tamil Nadu than almost anywhere else in the country, with higher levels of employment in manufacturing, declining numbers employed in agriculture, and agriculture accounting for less than 10% of net state domestic product. And secondly, you focus on the large numbers of social and medium enterprises owned by lower caste entrepreneurs, what you speak of in terms of the democratization of capital ownership. Now, these are telling arguments, no doubt, but I think the question remains of how far Tamil Nadu's economic performance is the outcome of productivist policies pursued by successive governments, rather than the outcome of sort of long-running historical path dependence. I think the evidence that you offer in chapter 5 of the book is actually patchy and rather slight. Earlier studies by both Padmini Swaminathan and Asima Sinha showed that the policies of the Dravidian parties in government have not had very positive effects at all. Swaminathan showed in the early 1990s that the state, in spite of enjoying the same historical legacy of port enclave development identified by Krishna Bharadwaj as Gujarat and Maharashtra, had lost ground to these two states, having by that time much lower levels of investment. Asima Sinha showed decline in industrial development indicators after 1965 and the relative failure of Dravidian governments until the turnaround in the 1990s after liberalization, when the DMK pursued a successful approach of, successful in some senses, a successful approach of liberalization by stealth. Neither Swaminathan nor Sinha found evidence of successful industrial policy. You say, Kalaiyarasan, in the introduction to chapter 5, that you'll contest the propositions of Swaminathan and Sinha, but there's no evidence to support that claim in the book. You ultimately rely, I think, quite heavily on the data you present on the democratization of capital and the extent of ownership of SMEs by OBCs and SCSTs in Tamil Nadu, in comparison with their shares in Gujarat and Maharashtra. In fact, in these comparisons, SCSTs in Tamil Nadu don't come out at all as doing better than in the two Western states. I mean, they don't. And I wonder whether the extent of ownership among OBCs in Tamil Nadu isn't in part a reflection of the fact that powerful locally dominant castes like the Gaundas in the western part of the state, perhaps Tevas and others in the south, are counted among the OBCs, whereas such locally dominant caste groups in the Western states are not, or were not, at the time on which the data in the analysis relies. And in the end, as you finally concede, upper caste, Brahmin, Chettiar, Naidu-owned business still has a commanding presence in the state's economy. So, in some, I think I should just sort of go back and emphasize that I think that the problem for me is that the evidence that you present of a conscious and deliberate commitment to what you refer to as a productive ethos, the evidence for that seems to me to be really rather slight, and it's I think it's far from clear that the relatively successful economic growth of Tamil Nadu is really so much the outcome of a deliberate set of policies on the part of the Dravidian parties, as you suggest. So, like others, I think I'd like to believe in the Dravidian model, but I'm not sure that I find very convincing evidence of there being a model in that sort of where the pursuit of social justice and economic growth, are mutually supportive, as you want us to believe. That's my 2 bits worth. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Harris, for continuing that line of thought of really important reflections and questions on the Dravidian model. So now I'll invite Professor Judith to please speak. Professor Hare, you can speak now. Professor Hare, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I have now unmuted. Thank you. First, of course, I'd like to thank the EPW group for having invited me to this session, and thank the participants for very strong and interesting contributions. I think that the Geetha's remarks are quite a hard act to follow for me too, and I'm going to speak at not nearly so much length as anyone else, I think. But the points I would like to make are, firstly, that I think it's quite dangerous to start thinking about this as a model that can be emulated anywhere else, because I don't think it's a strong enough model in itself, but I also don't think that it is a model that has enough positive aspects to it. And I think there's an awful lot that we are all pointing out, which is very negative about the experience of Tamil Nadu and about what's happened in Tamil Nadu. And I, for one, would not want other countries or other states to try to emulate that. I certainly also think, I feel very strongly that it's one thing to compare Tamil Nadu in a fairly broad and simplistic way to other states in India and say that, broadly speaking, yes, it's done better than other states in some respects, and that's certainly true. Whereas, in fact, if one compares it to what's been going on in other parts of the world, especially Southeast Asia, it's not looking very impressive at all. One of the things that strikes me about what's been happening is that it's taken such a long time for some of the changes that one would have hoped would have come about to actually take place. So the points that I would like to focus on in what I want to say about this are, firstly, that Tamil Nadu is still essentially a cheap labor economy in which large numbers of people are working in very low-skilled jobs for very poor wages and in very poor conditions. It's one thing to say Tamil Nadu has provided employment, But it's another thing to say that Tamil Nadu has not provided decent employment and that this has been going on for a very long time. Having followed what's been going on in villages in Western Tamil Nadu since 1980, I'm very struck by how little the wages and terms of employment have improved for the low-skilled labour after the middle 1990s. There certainly was a big improvement in agriculture as it came up to the level of what was going on outside agriculture in the 1980s and early 1990s. But after the mid-90s, when agricultural wages had more or less matched what was being paid outside agriculture, there hasn't really been nearly enough improvement over what's now nearly 3 decades in the conditions of employment and the conditions of life that the majority of low-skilled labourers are facing. I think what's so striking about the low-skilled labour that I've been watching certainly in Western Tamil Nadu is what very long hours people are working and what very hard jobs they're doing and how little remuneration they're getting. So they're having to work so long and having to work so hard in order to get what are very mediocre wages. So I think it's not that that's something which everybody isn't very aware of. It's just that one would have hoped there would have been more improvement over several decades in that respect than there has been. Of course, the conditions of the vast majority of the workforce are also reflected or are also explained by what's been happening in education. And the education figures may look impressive if you want to look at how much more participation in education there is. But if you look at the quality of education and you look at what skills people come out with or what jobs they're able to do as a result of the education they get, it's still a very poor scene. Very unequal too, of course, that there are some of the schools and colleges and universities that are producing very high quality output. But for the vast majority of people in Tamil Nadu, education is very dismal and very poor and is very, it's costing people a lot to put their children through school, to put their children through college, and to find at the end of it, not only do they not have the qualifications that would enable them to get good jobs, but that there aren't good jobs available. And I think that's something that needs to be stressed much, much more than has been in talking about the success of Tamil Nadu and getting so many more people into school and college. Going on from that, I mean, health is another area in which what's certainly happened in the last couple of decades is there's been an enormous change in the amount of healthcare that people seek as a result of poor health, and it's very expensive. So despite the fact that Tamil Nadu has programs to try to provide some form of health insurance and some public health facilities that are reasonable, really poor people are still spending exorbitant amounts of money when they have health problems, quite crippling, in fact. And this is something that's only come up in the past couple of decades. It wasn't a feature earlier. I think if I want to go on from these rather negative comments to say that I think that one of the successes of the recent developments in Tamil Nadu has been connectivity. Enormous amount of work, construction work on roads, feeder roads, water supplies, and other infrastructure, which is really very impressive in the most recent period. Similarly, an enormous amount of housing has been constructed, not all, of course, subsidized by the state, not always supported by the state, but people have been spending what money they have on housing to a degree that I would never have expected before. So the housing situation certainly looks to me as though it's coming up and much better than it was. Geetha has said something about gender. I think it's hard these days to discuss any of these major problems in the absence of any discussion of gender. And yet we still see people doing it, we still see in this book almost no mention of gender at all. Gender and feminist economics, the work on gender has come a long way. We now have a lot of really excellent work on gender, a lot of excellent work on the empirical side as well as on the theoretical side. We ought to be able to do a better job of incorporating it into our understanding of economic development and models of economic development and how they succeed or don't succeed. The gender story behind what happens in economic development is enormously important and enormously underestimated all over the world. But I think that's certainly something that we ought to be flagging and urging our colleagues to pay more attention to. Geetha's already quoted a bit of what I was saying on caste, but I still find it hard to accept that Tamil Nadu is quoted as being such a progressive state, a state that has achieved so much, a state that is so inclusive, and yet it has such a problem with caste. I mean, the caste discrimination, the caste tension, the caste violence, the everyday experience of caste amongst the lower caste groups, and particularly amongst Dalits and Adivasis, is something we have to confront and we have to think more seriously about, and think more seriously about whether we can praise a model of economic development that continues with these levels of discrimination and disadvantage. So I think my take on the discussion these days of the Dravidian model is that we have to be very careful not to hold it up as a model which is to be emulated. We have to be much more careful about recognizing the complexities of what's been going on behind the broad outline statistics. And we have to grapple with these and not let Tamil Nadu off the hook by saying, oh, well, it's doing rather well. I think the complacency is doing a disservice to the people in charge in Tamil Nadu, as well as those who are experiencing what's going on in Tamil Nadu. And I think that's where I will end. Thank you very much.
For your reflections on again some of the questions that I hope we'll be returning to in our discussion. So now I'd like to invite Professor Vijayabaskar to please speak. Professor Vijayabaskar, you can speak.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear
I'm
you.
audible? Okay, yeah, thanks, yeah. So yeah, thank you EPW for this opportunity and for organizing this panel discussion. I'll try and address some of the remarks that have been made by my fellow panelists. But before that, I'd like to start by making a couple of observations. To begin with, I mean, if you look at what the Congress is trying to do at the national level in terms of trying to offer a counter narrative to Hindu majoritarian kind of a narrative which the BJP is pushing forth, it looks like, it's approximates very much the Dravidian set of principles, which is what they're pushing for. For example, Rahul Gandhi spoke about removal of the 50% quota for affirmative action. He also spoke about reservation of to be implemented within the judiciary. He also rated the importance of caste census so that it will reveal the extent of deprivation across castes, and also highlighted the importance of English and undermining the role of Hindi and opening up to new worlds of education, as well as upholding the importance of federalism. Yeah. So it seems to me that some of the basic principles which inform the Dravidian movement and the mobilization seems to suggest and offer a powerful counter narrative to the Hindu majoritarian politics, which is now being kind of built on the other side. The second point, I think, which all my fellow panelists, particularly Geetha, John, and Judith, are not adequately paying attention to is the fact that Tamil Nadu is a subnational entity located very much within the principles of, the constitution and macroeconomic logic, and the kind of power structures, which are embedded, be it in the judiciary or in the union government, and not mentioned in the media and so on. I think we need to keep that in mind. And the kind of, in fact, what I would like to kind of reiterate is, if you look at the Tamil Nadu's growth trajectory, particularly in the 90s and 2010s, that was a time where the state, because of this move towards responsibilizing state governments for resource mobilization, in fact, gave an opportunity for the state to kind of experiment with a lot of policy measures, both in terms of the realm of production and also in the realm of welfare, which now is increasingly being undermined, or a scope being kind of cut down, both in terms of financial transfers. 40% of 40% of transfers are conditional transfers, and the extent to which you can actually maneuver, that space is increasingly shrinking. And not to mention, there is also idea of coming forth with the new industrial policy, which again has implications for what a subnational region can do or not do. I'll come back to that in a bit, because I think I might not have time to, extend my, points, clarify in these points. Let me try and address some of the points, important points which are made by these three panelists. Okay. One, I think what Geetha has particularly pointed out is the fact that when you look at South Indian states, other South Indian states indicators, Tamil Nadu may not look too different from the gains that, that other states may have experienced. That's not quite the case. What you will probably find is that states like Telangana, Andhra, Karnataka, and any of this, multiple parameters of social and economic development, you would find them doing better in one or two indicators than Tamil Nadu. But if you look at a composite index, be it social development or economic development, generally, Tamil Nadu does better than the other South Indian states. Now, the second important issue that Geetha raises is our method, which is what the point that she makes is that we kind of read civil aspirations into state action. Yeah, we actually identify a set of principles which inform the ideologues of the Justice Party, and then try and kind of draw a link with policy measures. And it's kind of not kind of well laid out. Now, for me, the point is, if you look at any, want to explain any development outcomes, it's extremely, extremely hard to make a claim in terms of exactly, what people think and to what extent it corresponds to what the state, wants. Just to give you another example, often what you find, not only in Tamil Nadu, in other parts of the country as well, is if you once implement a policy and then we try to kind of retract it or withdraw it, then, you find people protesting. So often what you find is that these claims that people make, which are driving policy making, does not happen by popular kind of demand or popular struggle. Often it happens through political mediation by elected representatives, as Narayanan has pointed out, by bureaucratic feedback, from people at different levels of the bureaucracy. So these are the channels in which, policy making gets framed. And one can also find a correspondence between the election manifestos of the parties and the kind of policy decisions that have been made, over a period of time. And I would imagine that this election manifestos do, in some sense, reflect, people's aspirations. Some of the other things, the everyday kind of violence. I'll talk about. The fact that this violence continues to kind of happen against Dalits. It is there's no two ways about the fact that it is not only it is a very, very deep fissure within the Dravidian model. No two ways about it. But I would like to kind of again follow what Kalai had spoken about. It also relates to what John also reasoned out about the role of land reforms and how this Dalit violence could have been mitigated, had there been absence of land reforms. Now, I would like to reiterate this fact. This is not, again, I don't think Kalai mentioned or suggested that this violence is kind of recent. I think all that we tried to establish is we need to kind of look harder at the nature of violence on Dalits. Okay, I'm told that my voice is dropping. Is that true?
Your voice is dropping. Can you just speak into the mic?
Okay. Okay. Fine.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah. That's better. Okay. Fine. Yeah. If you look at the areas, for instance, starting from schools, I mean, Geetha mentioned about government schools and how it is primarily a place where, lower segments of the backward classes and the Dalits populate. And that is exactly where you find, violence happening between, middle class and the Dalits. So what you find is even the perpetrators of this violence tend not necessarily from the imagination of what we would have as an elite backward class household, like a landed elite, but actually they also are the left behind sections within the larger development process. And the same would hold good for caste violence as well. In fact, if you were to look at the economic distance between Dalits and the middle caste, it's probably the highest in Western Tamil Nadu, which is where you find the least amount of physical violence kind of, happening. So we need to look harder at, I think that's the point, how these new changes, shifts have kind of, led to, antagonism between the middle class, particularly between the most backward classes, castes and the Dalits. In pockets of Tamil Nadu, which are relatively underdeveloped, rather than see it as an outcome of a long history of exclusion of Dalits as a part of the Dravidian project. And I think there's enough material in Tamil and elsewhere to show that Dalits were not necessarily excluded. The units, enough writings on Periyar, volumes have been brought about, which shows that, they were never have been excluded from the Dravidian project. Whether their incorporation has been adequately translated to gains for them, whether they have been kind of marginalized because of electoral politics, these are all questions we need to kind of address. But to say that this Dravidian project is an inherently anti-Dalit project is something hard to kind of buy. It goes by literature and, maybe several other things. Now, the other question about the granular details, I mean, definitely that's not part of the ambit of this book, to look at granular details and how, everyday violence of the on lower caste groups and so on. I think we have not done that. So I think we would rather not talk about what we have kind of not done. But again, coming back to this Dalit question versus the OBC question, I think it's important to, I mean, if one concedes that caste is graded hierarchy, then I think it's important to recognize that Dalits are the worst victims of caste oppression. But it's also important to recognize that they're not the only victims of caste oppression or caste hierarchy. Once you take this on board and then you look at how these caste relations are being played out, I think we might have a bit more nuanced understanding of this caste relations that are unfolding in Tamil Nadu. On the women's question, probably I will leave Kalai to kind of address it. Is that okay, Kalai? Might not have enough time on that. Okay, yeah. So coming to John's point about the productive ethos and Tamil Nadu's entrepreneurship, two things, John. I mean, the studies that you suggest, Padmini's and Asima Sinha's, I mean, Padmini's study, is very, very thin. And then to use that to say that ours is evidence is very thin, I personally disagree. The reason being this, I think consistently we have actually mapped 4 phases in which industrial development has taken place in Tamil Nadu. One, during colonial period, the kind of claims that Justice Party and the kind of initiatives that they undertook and the kind of oppositional politics that played in pushing for industrial development. And then we also mapped the second phase, which is the 47 to 67 phase, where the Congress Party has been in power, but through oppositional politics, there has been a consistent claim for various industries being set up, infrastructure being developed, and so on. I think we have given evidence of that. And then we also spoke about 1967 to early 1990s as one phase where there is a development of cooperatives. Then you also had industrial credit being extended, promotion of industrial estates, and whole range of measures. So, and then the 1990s is a different ballgame where, where Tamil Nadu, or for that matter, several states have, thing. So what I would like to kind of reiterate here is the following. One, and during the license Raj, there's very little, that one could do as far as industrial development is concerned, especially at the upper end of the spectrum. So all that was possible was actually to develop, small and medium-sized industrial estates. And we have actually pointed out that has really worked in Tamil Nadu. Now, when we say industrial development as an outcome of conscious policy, it is not just directed policy about setting up industries or attracting investment, but also about creating a set of enabling conditions for first generation youth to kind of enter into entrepreneurship. And here again, your reading of entrepreneurship data, I think it's not quite right. I think what you've tried to show is that, yes, our share of OBC population is higher in Tamil Nadu, but still the share of enterprises is higher, one. And Dalit, yes, we do also point out that the share of Dalit enterprises is not in proportion to the population of Dalit population in Tamil Nadu. But doesn't mean that, we've also had interaction with the Dalit Chamber of Commerce, and they provide evidence of how Dalit entrepreneurship has been made possible primarily by the fact that access to education has created a set of enabling conditions for them to enter into entrepreneurship. In fact, we visited a few incubation centers subsequently, and where we find much of these entrepreneurs are first generation entrepreneurs. And their entry into capital accumulation has essentially been through access to education, networks forged through higher education institutions and in the workplaces before they come back to form entrepreneurship. They got to form or become entrepreneurs. Yeah, the cheap labor global south. Now, I would like to kind of ask, can there be non-cheap labor global south economy? I would think not. So, this is very much the fact that you're part of a larger global system, where you get investments primarily because of a low wage cost advantage. And paradoxically, Tamil Nadu is a state where wage shares are relatively higher, wage rates in the manufacturing sector are relatively higher. And despite that, you have been able to attract industries, because normally you wouldn't be able to, because if you go by the wage cost logic, it would be very hard for you to kind of attract investments. But the very fact that you're able to attract is actually, this is something which I can bear out because I've been interacting with some of the investors. One primary reason is the quality of human capital, and the investments that the state has made in this, which has makes it attractive for global companies to come to Tamil Nadu, despite the fact its wages are relatively higher. So whether that's kind of whether that has made a huge difference to people's lives at the bottom of this thing, maybe not. But whether it has done nothing, I would definitely say it has done something. And the fact that women have been able to enter into the workforce, and 43% of the entire workforce in Indian manufacturing, women workers, Indian manufacturing, come from Tamil Nadu, says something not just about the policies, but also about the social norms that the state has been able to generate. So probably I'll stop now and I can come back again later. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Vijayabaskar, for giving us a very nuanced picture of what this debate entails. So before opening the webinar for the Q&A, since there's so many questions that have already been raised during the course of our discussion so far, I would like to give Dr. Kalai some time to respond to some of the questions that he may have also noted down. So Dr. Kalai, you can please speak now. Yeah.
Thank you, Geetha, for this generous request. So now, I just have a few questions to respond, because I did not know that it was a book discussion. I was not prepared for that. I thought it is more of placed understanding what's the issue broadly happening in the state and its developmental pattern and etc. So now I just confined, because I thought myself prepared, or myself assume, I identify myself as a comparative political economist and place this debate within that political economy, comparative political economy framework. I am not equipped to respond much to Geetha's ethnography of violence, nor of Judith's sociology of gender, etc. But I need to mention few things particularly to Professor Judith and also of Professor John Harish. One, namely, for Judith, so when you use this, it's a very well-established methods in the political economy, comparative political economy, use certain standard indicators, which is produced by either state agencies or the private agencies, or oneself collect from the village studies. If we say, for instance, the health is a problem, then if you use the out-of-pocket expenditure is an indicator, assuming the health economics uses. which is drastically has come down in the state, which is necessarily, it doesn't come out of blue. It comes with a certain set of inputs. That's what the most of the economists are concerned with, of the why out-of-pocket expenditure is high in certain contexts or low in certain contexts. These are all very intellectual important questions. It cannot be discussed by just simply a subjective experience of the health access, which is equally important. I am not dismissing any of the subjective experience of the agents or households or the class or the groups go through, but it's equally important to also understand the comparative numbers, how these numbers, how the statistics, how these actually figures come into being, which actually certain meaning. For instance, if I say Dalit access to education or the Dalit and the non-Dalit access actually has come down in terms of the enrollment has come down, enrollment has actually gone up and the distance has come down, it has a really a practical meaning. And similarly, when I say the Dalit entrepreneurship has, in fact, 1 out of 4 entrepreneurs in India placed in Tamil Nadu. This is an odd fact from economic census, and it is substantiated by Dalit Chamber of Commerce. And the second, in the wages, definitely globally, the wage contribution has come down. No exception, no state is except in global level, the wages has come down in the value addition data. But if you look at a comparative sense, still Tamil Nadu is resisting, of course, that measure. Of course, there is a decline, but you can still simply show how that figures stand out there. And similarly, if you take the informality, where in the world that the informality does not exist? Simply the question is how that informality is produced. What is the state interventions to cope up with that informality? Was there any state intervention at all to cope up with the informality? These are the questions that the economics are concerned with. But if you produce any of this number from any of the statistics produced by Government of India, produced by Government of Tamil Nadu, or any private agencies to substantiate claims, is actually valid discussions to have. And the second, it is about Tamil Nadu is a subnational state in a federal setup. It is not a nation state. And comparing with the Tamil Nadu with the, say, what is happening in the Scandinavian countries or what's happening in any of the outside of the global south is completely unfair. It is not a framework to understand a political economy, comparative political economy. Now coming back to the Professor John Arish's question, definitely very important question. He referred two important individuals whose scholarship is very important here. Who is the one is definitely of the Asima Sinha and my own Professor Bhatni Swaminathan. Bhatni Swaminathan's work is a one thin paper, a commentary piece in 1991. She summarized ASI data to make that claim. And I have more claims to make now, which is, for instance, there's a vibrant political economic group coming up, which says it identifies there is something called disguised state industrial policy across states, which actually did not explicitly say that the Tamil Nadu has an industrial policy, but there are measures which actually can be qualified as a disguised industrial policy across states. And Tamil Nadu was a pioneer in that sense, is having that industrial policy through the what's the institution called TATCO and so many agencies actually, which brought definitely intervened or facilitated the capital. So actually I was surprised to one level, anything that to do with the negative indicators, it is attributed to the state. Anything which is to do with the achievement of progress, it is attributed to the historical necessity, as if there's no agency to the historical necessity. I think I think there should be a fair account of, or perhaps if you're really interested in the social justice project, I think getting to the facts very important and understanding the facts and moving from there, actually where actually is how this arrived this facts. And how do we go from this? I think very important, because these are all something, again, entrepreneurship. Let me give an entrepreneurship very detailed. Of course, Professor John is very right. It is still controlled by the elite of the certain caste groups, which is his own ethnographic study source. If I use the other broad data sets, like, of course, Professor Barbara Harish White used, it was 2004. In fact, I contested that figures. If you extend that into 2014, there's a remarkable engagement of the certain caste groups, which is actually, that is precisely why you see the pushback from the dominant communities against the Dalit and the low caste, because there isn't a progress, there isn't a assertion, there isn't a definitely a visibility. This visibility is actually well established by range of studies. So another thing I want to make, none of these claims that we make here is just based on our own numbers. If I take the labor one or the worker stick, it's again well established by Rena Agarwala in the informal sector. If I take social development is again well established by Prerna Singh in our own terms. So each of the indicators, each of the domains is well established by those people who work in the comparative political economy. So which does not mean that we should whitewash the violence that is taking place in the other part of domain. Of course, that is precisely the social scientist's job, is to why in a state where you see the remarkable improvement in the certain basic indicators and also see the remarkable violence, how do we actually add up this fact and concerned with or reckon with? I think that is precisely our scholarship should have been. Not, I mean that's precisely, I think, because I'm not qualified to talk about the violence or talk about the sociology. Sorry, I went off.
Kalaiyarasan, do you want to switch off the video and speak? Will that help?
Yeah. I just make a last point with respect to the gender, which is again very important. Ashwini Deshpande, Professor Ashwini Deshpande has been working on the importance of the issues of the women participation in the labor market across states. I want to make it very clear. If you take any indicators, you take the participation, if you take the of the formal labor, in all of these indicators, you see the remarkable level of entry of the woman in the sense. But again, you also see the same. I'm just giving you one indicators as per the ASC data, which again Ashwini Deshpande mentions in many of her articles. 43% of the ASC formal workforce of the women is placed in Tamil Nadu. How that is possible without having any access to the education or any access to the woman? And the second, if you take any measure of, it's again, we have to see the level. Of course, the level is definitely lower than the most of the South Asian states, or even if you take the Southeast Asia. But we'll have to account of the relative position, how that actually progress become possible. What are the mechanisms? What are the ways in which this happened? But again, you can ask this question, whether the wage condition are okay, whether the wage condition is really comparable, whether the working condition is comparable. That is well taken. Definitely there is a discrimination. Definitely there is the working condition is a problem. There is definitely a informality of the woman is facing. But that indicator has to be put in juxtaposed along with the indicators that we see in a big measure. So what I appeal to the authors is or the panelists to look at the picture in a holistic way, of course, bring all of these aspects together. It is my claim, definitely not in the book, that we claim that the Dravidian is model something to be emulated across India. Not at all. In fact, if it is a first caveat to the model is, it's just an illustrative idea to just summarize what has happened in the state. No way to make a claim that it is something replicable to the other context. One important thing I want to make I'm not a political scientist, may be useful for the political scientists to understand why this actually a pollution or why this kind of economic development or a political intervention matters. Given the polarization, given this hierarchy, it's well established again in the political science literature. Any society which is divided actually has a less potential, less scope for public goods, which is known. Again, in a country like India, which you have a graded inequality. For example, if you take the UP, which actually really well established, had a power of the Dalit prime minister. But look at the public goods. Again, it's a serious problem. Again, if you take the BR, which is well established, again, you had an identity movement, caste-based movement for the dignity, but did not produce any positive or you call as a public goods provision. So you contrast that. Here you have a collision, which is obviously there is a fracture. But as a build some kind of a collision to intervene certain public goods, particularly for education. I can provide numbers. If you follow the Myron Weiner thesis of the 1950s, it was probably India is the only country in the world which provided under education. In fact, it curtailed the funding for the primary education and favored the Indian elites. That's the 50s and 60s of the planning. On contrast, if you look at Tamil Nadu, in fact, it actually early focused on the primary education. Thanks to Kamaraj, of course, there are other political mobilization. If you look at the clear numbers, how those numbers actually came in, what are the schools opened, how the schools actually distributed across. So what I want to appeal is building those schools, building those primary healthcare. Let me give another example. Primary healthcare of compared to any statistic did not come out of blue. Definitely there wasn't a conscious agency. How do you actually dismiss those conscious agency? Will it say it is because the instrumental way? I think it is a very complex, as you rightly said, it's a very complex process. We need to accommodate this aspect and juxtapose this with the emerging violence or the violence is historically constituted. But just dismissing the numbers that does not matter without any founding or providing any alternative numbers, perhaps is not the way. I think I learned my scholarship from most of this panelists. In fact, you are the inspiration for me, particularly for John Harish. I think your book and your work is inspiration me, and I method clearly follow of your framework of understanding developmental state, what is the relationship between bureaucracy and industrial policy and the state. I stopped here. Thank you.
Ankit, can I just come in briefly, or would you like me to wait?
Sure.
I think that there's a sense of dismay that the achievements of the Dravidian governance system have not been sufficiently acknowledged. As someone who's not lived anywhere else but in Tamil Nadu, I would be the last one to say that nothing has changed and so on. But I think we need to establish with a greater degree of clarity, and not just within a subnational context, while retaining the subnational context in terms of the pressures on local governments, the very completely unworkable federal model that we have, the powers that a unitary state possesses, all of that is something that none of us would dispute. And there is great virtue in the federal model. But I think if you were to actually look at governance and its outcomes, while staying even with such facts that you have given, as I said, I'm not competent to comment on those, and I take them for what you've provided me with. But I also want us to think of how governance of this kind cannot really be separated from a constitutive violence of governance in a semi-democratic context. We have not realized democracy anywhere in India to the extent which we would be happy to realize it. So if you keep that in focus, then we can also look at some of these other questions about other castes also being deprived. For instance, what has happened to agriculture in Tamil Nadu? That people are exiting agriculture is one part of the story. The other part is what happens to agricultural castes, like the 1 years, for example. And what happens to those who are not invested in education or in the modern industrial sector? And how does that play out as caste violence? If some of these things have been part of your analysis, I'm not saying you ought to have brought in sociology or granular analysis or civil liberty stuff, but just in the theoretical framework you set up, if you are to do a next edition, you take some of these arguments on board and then consider some of your outcomes in the light of those broader issues, we'll have a more nuanced and a more challenging picture to think with, not to downgrade anything that has been achieved, but to see them with a greater degree of possibility and what is simply not doable or that does not have the political will for it to be realized for whatever set of reasons. So I just want to say that, and I'm not coming in anymore, Ankit. Thank you.
Can I respond?
Yeah. Professor Vijayabaskar, you can.
Yeah. No, it's again about Lucknow and lack of political thing and so on. I mean, I think maybe the original conceptualization Lucknow has not kind of laid out the role of power within his idea of a bloc or a populist bloc and so on. But I think it offers a very powerful framework, especially in a multi-ethnic, multi-class, multi-caste kind of a society where interests are very, very disparate. So how do you kind of bring them together, which conventional class politics may not help? And this is where I think, and the fact that the Dravidian mobilization sought to bring together multi-caste, I mean, definitely hierarchical, definitely oppressive over somebody else while being a victim of oppression at another level. So you're even able to bring them together on a logic of equivalence, right? So you say that, yes, we're all kind of coming together with a common framework, which is against a set of elites. And then this is the common agenda, which means, you kind of determine the set of norms that valorize caste, then you kind of create opportunities, you kind of invest in education. So these are all kind of, demands which are kind of proposed by lower caste groups, and you come them together. And as I pointed out in a book, the problem is once these gets institutionalized, then interventions always actually work on logic of difference, right? So then, you have a separate thing for backward classes, you have a separate thing for most backward castes, then you have separate things for Dalits. And then within Dalits, you might have to create a separate reservation for Arundhatias. So it works on a politics of difference, and how these things play out. I mean, we are not giving out answers for all these things. All that we are saying is that this is how these fractions are kind of, this frictions are kind of playing out. And this implication, so you need to kind of, again, what are the possibilities of forging a new bloc? We do not know. But the key point is the basic principles which have driven this mobilization has within it to forge new and, horizontal solidarities for a more substantive, to democratize or extend the process of, democratization. I think there's nothing against it. I think we should make it very clear. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Vijayabaskar. Now, I mean, we are slightly running out of time, so I'm gonna club the questions together and then direct them to our panelists. And again, apologies if I'm not able to take all the questions that have been asked in the chat box. So Neeti is asking two questions. The first, and this question is directed to Kalai and Professor Vijayabaskar. So the first question is about the development model in Himachal Pradesh, which is that of which, I mean, could it be characterized as a model of development without considerable growth? And Niti is also saying that growth comes at the cost of some place or people, and raises the issue of how the proponents of growth deal with the conflict of interests of those who are at the receiving end of it. And so following that, shouldn't Himachal Pradesh be on the right top quadrant with the axes redefined accordingly? And she's also asking about the oppressed caste mobility, if there's any more information on that in the context of Himachal Pradesh. And the other question is slightly, broad, which is to say whether there has been, in the discussion, whether there has been an unstated and perhaps an unconditional celebration of industrialization and capitalism. Along with that, I have also clubbed one question of Arun, which is pointing to the fact of prevalent corruption in Tamil Nadu, where instances of bribery are sort of rampant. So, in spite of the fact that reservations and other kinds of affirmative action were formulated from the 1920s onwards, availing government jobs is not possible in all instances without also indulging in some corruption. So Professor Vijayabaskar and Kalai, both of you can perhaps pitch in on these two or three sets of questions.
Kalai, you want to go on?
Maybe I'll take the first question, Himachal Pradesh. Maybe you can take the second question, Professor. Yeah. Take the first question. Yeah, thanks, Nidhi. Yeah, it's very important. Definitely, if you follow the literature, because I'm not an expert on Himachal Pradesh, what I understand from the literature, definitely the Himachal's contribution to school education. Because as you know, in India, there's an elite bias of the school education. Only in 2000, you actually ensured all kids in school. In fact, that is one of the reasons why India's what you call as a structural transformation did not take place. That's what the most of the economy is historical neglect of education. If you take that account, Himachal was one of the, in fact, the shortest time actually ensured the school education. I think no other state in that level of short span of time ensured school education, given its territory, given its topography of the mountain and hill. It definitely ensured, which is seen as an achievement of Himachal Pradesh. One, again, the second also aspect of Himachal Pradesh also sanitation and the health indicates, again, which is seen as a state active or state state is partly part of the process in terms of ensuring those. I think two set of thing, education definitely, and followed by sanitation, but particularly the open and other stuff, which is seen as a remarkable achievement of the Himachal Pradesh. In fact, many actually suggest that should be seen for other states, particularly of the open system, which actually serious, as a connection, range of connection with the disease and the preventive disease in the country. So that's definitely with respect to growth. And I see now I hear and also look at the recent term, there is definitely a surge of the growth, particularly of the pharmaceutical industry and certain industry coming up there, which I would think of either, think of this either is a big, since you build the human capital, therefore it attracts industry there, and therefore you have a growth is something open to the debate. What attracts the investment? Is it geography? It is the subsidies? It is the human capital that, already you have a well-educated workforce is attracts. It's something that is open to the debate. But I do see that it is actually now I would think of as really picking up in that sense of combining this both. That I think would second, with respect to the question of celebration of industrialization, capitalism, again, I need to qualify, we are actually not talking anything transcending capitalism of the framework, not at all. This is the capitalism in the global south. This is going to stay within this. What is the possibilities of achieving a relative degree of inclusion with respect to working condition, wages, or even the basic access? So definitely we are not talking about transcending capitalism framework, not at all. Is within this framework, what is actually happening here? why in certain state within those capital constraint are able to, for example, Kerala does in the capital constraint broadly, but still does intervene in certain indicators. Of course, its Communist Party has a certain vision of the transcending capitalism, but it very much operates within the capitalist framework. No, in fact, take the Brazil example, Lula's example. Although he is a worker class struggle, and very much, we need to ensure what is available within us. Of course, we can have a vision and desire and, of course, ambition and thinking of transcending capitalism, but we need to also be mindful of the India's case when we talk about capitalism or models of the development. It is actually one of the serious problem or the fundamental problem of the original sin of India is the caste. It is, as Dr. Ambedkar said, it is a graded inequality. And actually, the graded inequality is connected not just only for the oppressed. It is also actually does not have, if you follow the annihilation caste, Dr. Ambedkar says there is no in the public at all because people are divided by caste. So to bring these communities together and to even to make a common vision for any intervention is a political labor. So that's a political labor. So that political labor, whether do we have a vision, the parties or the political institution in India have that vision, bringing this caste together and to have a common interventions, whether it is a capital or outside of the capital. It is something I think we need to reckon with. The grand ideas, I think very important there. Yeah, thank you. Now, Bhaskar, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, on this industrialization part, again, there's nothing, you take even socialist countries, they all are pursuing industrialization of different kinds. So whether it's a necessary evil, that's a question, that it's hard to kind of say this claim, but given the global understanding or the mainstream understanding, left and right, understanding what it takes to develop, clearly, moving people out of agriculture, low productive agriculture, moving people out of, small, low productive agriculture is very, very critical to secure not just better incomes, but also, I think in the context of Tamil Nadu in societies like India, where, traditional occupations are always caste-bound, modernization is very, very critical to erase this caste-based distinctions. So how you kind of move them, I think that's very, very critical. Now, what it leads to in terms of resource exploitation, extraction, pollution, and so on, that's a question. I mean, I think, again, all governments are kind of engaging with, but whether any government has a solution, whether within India or outside, I kind of found it hard. Best, you can only, push the pollution out of your borders. We have done that to some extent, but it will only goes to, poorer regions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Vijayabaskar. Now, I mean, there are two questions on the general, sort of Professor here and Professor Harris, since you've done extensive fieldwork in the state since the 70s and the 80s. So Karthik is asking that there are many Vanyars and Thevars who complain that the Dravidian parties have not done enough for them, and they do lag Nadars. Can we say that Dravidian politics is anti-MBC/DNC? So that's the first question. And G. Sai Balaguru is asking about the deprivation of the lower OBCs, and they're also saying that a select group of OBC castes have achieved political and employment representation as compared to other OBCs. So why didn't Dravidian parties disqualify the status of these highly represented castes from the OBC status? Since OBC creamy layer is also not implemented in the state, does that make the Dravidian model class blind? And these questions sort of become relevant since the early 1970s. So Professor Hare and Professor Harris, if you can pitch in on these two questions. Professor Harris, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, you were, Ankit, you were being, in my system anyway, you were being scrambled as you were speaking. So I'm just having a look at the texts of the questions that have been raised in the chat box. Judith, perhaps you can come in while I'm just reading what the questions are.
Professor, here you want to...
I have the same problem. I'm not quite sure what it is that you're asking us to discuss. Can you repeat?
No, okay.
Yeah.
So Kartik's question was about Vanyas and Tevas who complain Dravidian parties have not done enough for them. They do lag behind in comparison to certain mobile backward castes like Gondas and Nadas. Can we say that Dravidian politics is anti-MBC, DNC? I mean, this seems the question itself seems to me to reflect, what actually Kalaiyarasan and Baskar do reflect upon in the later part of the book, which is the extent to which the horizontal mobilization that you've emphasized as intrinsic to the Dravidian movement has in many ways broken apart. That casteism, casteism has fragmented that horizontal mobilization of the Dravidian movement. Isn't that what the question itself raises? Judith, you're scowling, so you obviously don't follow my argument.
I'm scowling because I'm trying to read the questions.
Okay. So, I mean, I'd like to, Kartik, I'd like to ask Kartik to respond on this. I mean, the question itself reflects that fragmentation that Kalaiyarasan and Baskar do speak of in the conclusion to the book. While I'm looking at the second question.
I think what I would say here is that it's very easy to get into endless discussions about the different position of different caste groups and the different conflicts and different claims they have to be treated differently or separately. But in my experience of Tamil Nadu, there's always been a very big divide between Dalits and non-Dalits. And I think that one of the things that's been so clear is that the Dravidian parties have found it difficult to bridge the distinction or to include both the Dalits and the various backward castes of other kinds in any policy, which doesn't seem to be producing conflicts between them. I think that it's very clear in the Tamil Nadu case how badly off the Dalits are. Of course, there are other groups that are quite badly off, and they may need some attention as well. But in the end, there has to be some way of bringing together a movement in which all of the disadvantaged groups feel that they have voices, but are not necessarily the competitive one is more disadvantaged than another, but they need some acknowledgement that they are falling below the line as opposed to above the line compared with some of the more privileged castes. But I definitely think, I mean, certainly everything I have seen suggests that Dalits need a very special help or special support, special position, that all the policies that have been in place to try to strengthen the position of Dalits have been nothing like enough. And other caste groups may resent these and may resent the fact that various policies have favored Dalits, and maybe they felt they should be, they are as disadvantaged as Dalits. But in the long historical story, it's very clear how badly Dalits have been doing relative to the other groups. And I don't know if that answers anyone's questions, but that certainly comes back to where I stand on this.
Yeah.
No, I mean, this was really useful. Professor Harris, you want to continue with your response? Or
Sorry?
I mean, I can move to other questions in the chat
Yes.
box as well. So Lavanya is asking, can you please elaborate on how anti-casteism is different from anti-Brahminism, and which of the two would you consider Dravidian politics to be? I mean, Geetha has written extensively on these questions, and Geetha ma'am, would you try to answer this?
Yeah, I'm going to keep my video off because my bandwidth is not great.
Sure.
I think the question is a complex one. I would not sort of say that there's one way of looking at it, that you start out being anti-casteist and then you become anti-Brahmanical and then you start supporting particular caste groups. It doesn't follow such a linear pattern. I do think there was a great political, social, and cultural will to forge a large non-Brahmin, upper caste community, so to speak, political community from the 1900s onwards. But when that political community has to also function at the level of the social, particularly in terms of family, in terms of communities and so on, to use an old-fashioned phrase, the unity forged at the barricades comes apart when you enter the mohalla, or when you enter the actual spatial environment in which castes live. This is something that Ambedkar has pointed out in different contexts and in different circumstances. And you also see this in the writings of Dalit activists who were both with the Communist Party and not, and who shared space with the Communist Party without becoming members, like Ramchandra More from Maharashtra. So I think it's always a work in progress, this attempt to forge unity at all levels. Now, anti-Brahmanism, of course, is a very important aspect of anti-casteism. But here, I would really like to conceptually differentiate the kind of graded inequality that is endemic to the caste order from untouchability. And once again, we have to turn to Ambedkar for this conceptual clarity, because he makes it very clear that the differences between caste deemed Shudra within the triangle that is the caste order may be legion, and graded inequality can be cruel. It has to do with resources, status, with entitlements or the lack of them. But he also says that the line that differentiates these castes is like a veil. The same, it's like a curtain. Same metaphor that Du Bois uses about race. But the differences that exist between those within the triangle and those outside, and he deliberately uses the term iron curtain. So I think that is a structural feature, and Judith also has been pointing out in some different ways. And that structural feature affects economic choice, it affects your access to entitlements, and the struggle is at the everyday level, whether you want to participate in a local auction for fish, for catching fish, whether you want to garner the local tamarind harvest. Dalits only get there after struggle, even though they may have constitutional rights guaranteed, even though the government might have stipulated they should be part of it. And this is where I think the politics of governance becomes very important. How will a government machinery translate policy and directive into action when that same government machinery is used against the people at opportune moments? This is a difficult challenge for all governments to negotiate, but you cannot separate these out and say we will look at this, but this can wait another day. So there's that. So anti-Brahmanism is still valid. It's very important. It still has to be continued to be addressed and fought against. But anti-casteism also has to be supplemented by a resolute commitment in favor of Dalit rights, which are always going to exceed what they demand in terms of their numbers in the population. Again, to quote Ambedkar, it's not enough to grant rights in terms of proportional representation. He uses the term adequate. And the term adequate is very interesting. Who is to deem what is adequate? That comes through political struggle, negotiation, and argument. So it's not that one belittles political labor in any of this, but when does political labor stop? When does it turn into rhetoric? When is it used to justify policy? How does one remember history? If you're making an argument about ideas and practice, then one needs to account for these things. So these are also some things that we may want to keep on board. And there is a difference between anti-Brahmanism and anti-casteism, but also between the two and politics that respects the fundamental constitutional and other rights of Dalits. And I think all three are conceptually related, but also conceptually different. So I will stop there, Ankit.
So we'll take one final question from Mr. Chatar Singh. two questions actually. So what are the major and minor parameters of the Dravidian model? I think this question has been partially answered in the course of our discussion anyway. But the second question is, how is the Dravidian model different from the much publicized Gujarat model? And perhaps Professor Vijayabaskar or Dr. Kalai can answer this.
I think Kalai should answer this better because he's written on this as well. Kalai.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Kalai, can you hear us?
Just reading the question. Thanks, Sangeet. I'm just reading the question. Yeah. So yeah, actually, as you said, the parameters are well defined. I must repeat here. It's not a model to be emulated. That's not the spirit of which we came out with as an idea. It's an illustration of what has happened in the state, of kind of call as an interpretation. That's what even we meant by, say, when you say the model, interpreting something happened and looking up this whole parts into the whole. That's how we defined. With respect to Samatvapuram, equality of villages, banning, and see, definitely that kind of idea, whether this is again, we're going back to the same question, how much the political common sense of anti-caste, how much is a rhetoric, how much actually is internalized by the leadership or the whoever is responsible of introducing certain policies, whether they consciously were actually doing this because of understanding the caste is bad, caste has to go. Definitely, but I would say, like, having said all the flaws of earlier chief minister, some of the chief, particularly Kalaiyarasan, who was responsible for Samatvapuram, I think he deeply felt that some way one can, erase this question, at least address the caste question. He deeply felt, I would say, of caste should go. But method that he adopted or the political constraint, one can think of all of that. One example, I would say, if you look at the caste violence reports, where he clearly mentions Samatvapuram came after that response, series of caste violence in southern part of Tamil Nadu, where he actually appointed a committee and said, how do we address this? Then the committee said we can, address through the industrialization, building more industry, building, generating more jobs, we can address. One may question, how can you actually resolve the question, of the caste, which is more of the sociological and history, and you can resolve that through the economic measure by building more factories or more jobs. Will it solve? But I think it partly at least provided, one can say, of channelized the youth energy and also provided opportunities for many. One can think of, one can, how do you read that story of this is actually very much happening. When I can refer the committee name, it's a Morgan Committee, Justice Morgan Committee. In fact, the Samatvapuram came later, an idea, because we know the, as you said, caste is very graded, and of course there's a habitation is neatly defined based on the caste location. And he felt that, if you can bring people together at one place, transcending caste, again, one can say it's a failure, did not work. So again, question is how much, failure is again part of the same society, right? It's a part of the same society. So I would definitely go with the Geetha in that sense, to really work with the social relation on the ground. So how much is the government who should do, that's a separate, even as a collective, as a informed citizen who believe in sense of equality, what is our role in making our social relation around us caste free? So partly the Samatvapuram failure is partly of the societal failure, of course. There was a bill on the part of the government to bring this caste together, but definitely it's a failure. I think it's not something one or other. I would say it's a collective failure. If at all it was failed in many ways. I think pulling off again a rickshaw, definitely it was in the mind of. I think it is definitely attached to the caste. Any occupation in India, you have to see the caste angle to it. Who actually does the job? What is historically? Who actually going to benefit? Which communities, which caste, what is the actually respect, the social, both the resources, respect, dignity, all distributed by the caste frame. So that way we need to think of these policies too through that lens. Definitely there is a connotation to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kalai, for that response. And with that, I'd like to conclude today's webinar. We slightly moved ahead of the time that we had planned for this, but I think we had a really enriching discussion throughout. And before ending the webinar, I'd just like to thank all our panelists once again for joining from different parts of the world, and for accommodating the kind of varied questions that were raised today. And I'd also like to thank the EPW editor, Professor S. Mahendra Dev, for supporting us in organizing this webinar, as well as the entire Engage team. So Divya, Priyam, Johan, Tia, and Akanksha, for helping us organize these events in a very efficient and beautiful way, given that everything from designing the poster to inviting all the panelists is sort of managed by them as well. So yeah, thanks to the Engage team once again. And with that, I'd like to officially conclude the webinar for today. Thank you so much again for joining, all of you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Ankit and the
Thank you.
PTW team.
Thank you all. Yeah. Bye.